This week, we're talking about historical versions. This is a new feature that's in public preview at the moment that allows you to track the version of the file that was sent, either via email or via Teams chat. Now, the reason why this is important, especially if you're doing investigations, is when you're doing that data retrieval, collecting that evidence, you want to know what was the version of the file that was shared at that point in time, not the version that is the latest one, because you're probably missing information there. So we'll talk about why that's important next. Really, this is a short overview about this new capability. So let's put it into a scenario for you. So we've got Sam and Alex. They're having a conversation via Microsoft Teams. They're having a chat. And then Sam decides to share a document. So the way that Teams works is it doesn't take a copy of that document and then put it into the chat. It actually puts it into that person's OneDrive for Business account and then creates a sharing link across to Alex. Now, if you're having a conversation within a channel within Microsoft Teams, this works slightly different, but you're using SharePoint then as that repository, and you're creating that sharing link then to share with that recipient. The way that that works is once that's shared, Alex will open up that link to that single document and is, if they've got rights, able to make edits and changes to that document. Thus, it's making another version of that content. We still have one file, but we're having Delta changes to those files under the covers. So we'll talk about how that works in SharePoint and OneDrive in a moment. Let's talk about kind of the challenges of this, especially if you're in a highly regulated industry where you need to make sure that people aren't sending maybe hidden messages, or maybe there was some information that wasn't captured as part of that eDiscovery or that legal process. This could be key to making sure that you have all the information available as part of that investigation. So again, Sam and Alex are having a conversation here. These are trying to show, over a period of time or a period of weeks or even a year, right? They're having these conversations and then sharing this single file, but making iterations, making changes to those files, right up from version 1, say, right up to version 55. Now, if this document is being used not just by Sam and Alex, but other people within the business, they may also be making changes to that individual file, which means over a period of time, if we skip to the next slide, is lots of these changes might happen, and the current version of this file is this one at the very bottom, version 200, say, right? This is a constantly used file, but as we're doing our investigation, we want to find the version that was shared at the time between Sam and Alex, and we want to find out what was in that document that period of time. So this is the file that we're interested in, this version 55, and this is the date and time that it was actually shared. We're not interested in the current version where all of those changes and that document may have morphed over time. We want to be able to see the file and the content that was shared at that time. So this is where historical versions come in. It allows you to basically index all those different versions, make them searchable, and when you're doing that eDiscovery case, being able to bring back that version of the file. Pretty sweet. What we're also able to do as part of this preview is, as someone is sharing a modern attachment or a cloud attachment between someone or a recipient, we're able to tag that document, that content. So we can say, have a retention label apply to each of that content that's shared. In this case, called cloud attachment. So it tags that document, and it may have an associated retention policy saying that if you see any of these modern attachments being shared, hey, keep those for 3 years and maybe delete that after that period. So this is pretty cool when we talk about compliance and where data lives within Teams. Now, you're probably all used to using the Teams client to share content or have conversations. You may be using Federation as well, so you're talking to people outside of your organization. But as you're having those conversations, the chats are stored within Exchange Online. Now, depending on what type of conversation you're having, if that's a one-to-one or a one-to-many conversation, the area in which those chats are saved are within those individuals' mailboxes. So if I'm having a chat with you, for example, I would have a copy of that conversation within my mailbox. In a secure area, I can't see that as an end user, but it's stored within my mailbox in a shared, in a secure area. If I'm now sharing content between one person and another person, so those one-to-one chats, I am creating a modern attachment or a cloud attachment. And if you've ever noticed trying to drag a file from your desktop, for example, into a chat within Teams, it takes a second to load. There's a little loading bar that happens. And what it's doing is copying that content from your desktop to your OneDrive for Business site, your personal OneDrive for Business site. And it's creating that sharing link and a permissions setup then to be able to have that recipient view that version of the file. Now, if you're using Teams and channels, if you're uploading content within there is a SharePoint site that gets created as part of that team. So that's where the content sits within there, but it's the same principle. So it's creating a sharing link from that SharePoint site and then sharing that out to the recipient. This is super cool because we can use Microsoft Purview and all of the functions and features within the compliance suite to be able to do things like eDiscovery or in-place hold or do content searches, right? So we're collecting all of that evidence. We can also do things like ingest third-party data. So if you're using things like Zoom or Slack today, you can ingest that data into that user's mailbox and also have the advantages of things like eDiscovery and insider risk and communication compliance, depending on what type of data you're ingesting within there. So we're skipping around a little bit. We talked about data being stored within those repositories, whether it's Exchange for chat or SharePoint for content. But the way that the versioning works under the covers is there are multiple different folders within a OneDrive for Business or a SharePoint site. So if you have an Excel document within a team in a channel, for example, that would be stored within the document library. But if you have things like versioning turned on, so by default, every SharePoint site has versioning turned on. So it's up to 500 revisions and all major versions. You can change that if you want to, or an admin can change that to minor versions or less or more revisions. But when we turn on things like retention policies or retention labels, it's taking a copy of that content and put it into this yellow area, this preservation hold area at the very bottom. Now, historical versions is doing the same thing. So the way that it works is exactly the same, but as we're sharing different versions of that content, it's actually dropping down into this preservation hold library as a GUID. And we'll try and show you that in a little bit. So we're using the same structure. That's what I'm trying to say. And historical versions is specific to the content. This has nothing to do with the chat. It's about the content, the modern attachments and the cloud attachments that is shared within there. If we have a quick look about how retention policies are set up. Now, we talked about content being stored within the document library, but if there's no historical versions or there's no retention policy set up, if you go in and delete that content, the normal behavior, the normal retention period is this first and second recycle bin. And it takes up to 93 days in order for content to traverse through that first and second stage recycle bin before it's purged forever. You can never get that back. When we talk about historical versions, or we're talking about preservation hold, or we're talking about retention policies, this is where items or a copy of the item is held within the preservation hold library. And then we can have an associated retention period to say when the cleanup is. So if we say we want to create a policy that holds any cloud attachments being shared for a period of, say, 3 years, and then we can automatically delete that, then the preservation hold library holds it there. A SharePoint site admin can see the preservation hold library, but they can't make any changes to content there. They can't delete it, for example. They could restore it if you wanted to, but normal users don't have permissions to do anything with that preservation hold library. They can't even get into it, right? So an example here in Microsoft Teams is a conversation that's happening within a specific channel. So we know documents that are stored within a channel are saved in the allocated SharePoint site, right? And within this conversation, we can see this single file being shared, and they're talking about updating this content. Now, if we go in, we can see this latest version of the file, right? When we open this. Versioning is turned on by default, as I said. So up to 500 revisions or major versions. So as they're making changes to this, the actual platform is saving all major versions. And we can see that very easily if we go into files here. And if we view in SharePoint view, we just switch across to SharePoint for a second, and we go into the same folder. And we find our file, which is the C annual report. And then we click on this ellipsis here to be able to bring the version history up. This is where we can see all of the iterations of this file that's being changed. So all the way from version 1 all the way to version 13, which is the latest, and everything in between. Now, if you didn't know already, these delta changes also equate to your quota within SharePoint. They're not full versions of the document. They're just the changes that happened from version 3 to version 4, for example. But this is how we can see that version history. Historical versions is turned on in a different way. So versioning is turned on, great. Remember, the key difference between historical versions is being able to index each of those versions so we can bring that back as part of our eDiscovery case. So the way that we enable historical versions is over here in the compliance portal under eDiscovery Premium. So it's an eDiscovery Premium feature. And then if we go across to eDiscovery Premium settings at the very top here, then we get this new feature that we can turn on. So by default, it's turned off. Just a word of warning, while it's in preview, when you turn this on, you cannot turn it off. Once this is on, though, we can go in and start to enable each SharePoint site that you want to have historical versions turned on for. And again, as part of this preview, once these are enabled, you won't be able to turn them off. So quick and easy, we can click on Enable. We can search for our specific SharePoint site if we want to do that. So we can pick one and we could hit Enable. Now you can see here, I've already got this Mark 8 project team enabled. It does take a couple of days for this feature to actually be turned on. So you need a little bit of patience there. And once that's turned on, like I said, it's going to go through all those different versions, all those iterations, and make those available as part of that index. So when we go in eDiscovery and we're typing out our content search, our collection, it's actually looking inside all of those different versions that we've turned on and be able to look inside them. And we can bring that information back. So when Sam and Alex are having that conversation, we can go back to a specific period of time and see that version of the content that was shared. Pretty cool. Okay, so once that's enabled, we can go in and I've started to create a few different kind of test collections. So that single document I showed earlier on, I've started to have like different keywords in there so I could show those versions that I was bringing back. So I've got things like Bastion and Conundrum and a few other words that are quite particular that I could bring out and make sure that if is the information that I was looking for. So part of this at the moment, we could run a collection and get some estimates from the back of it. If I click on the right one, click on this top one here for a second. So we can see we've got 93 different files. Let me just show you what I was searching for. So I was looking across all custodians. So remember, if you've added particular custodians to a case, that kicks off a deep index of their content. That's not mandatory, by the way, but it's just good practice. If you know the people you're looking for, then we can start to kick off that deep index. There's no non-custodial data. This feature is only going to look inside SharePoint. So SharePoint includes things like OneDrive for Business, because that is SharePoint under the covers. It's just a personal site to that individual. It's not going to search anything for Exchange. Remember, this is not a feature for chat messages and things, but we can bring back chats and the version of the file that was shared within SharePoint. And this is what I'm going to do just to kind of streamline, again, best practice kind of scoping the searches to that particular person I'm looking at. So I've typed in recipients equaling Bert. And just to kind of narrow things down a little bit further, I'm looking for anything that is a docx file. Pretty simple. Next thing on this screen, a couple of things to be aware of is when we're collecting items and then putting it inside a review set, is these options will be ungrayed for you when you create a new one. We want to make sure that this one's ticked. So collect cloud attachments from items found in your search results. So that one needs to be ticked. That feature's been there for many years now, so it's nothing new. Again, another feature that is not new, which is collect all versions from the SharePoint items. Now, this feature's always, well, nearly always been available where you could just say, those 13 versions of that file I had, just bring everything back for me. But they wouldn't be indexed. This historical version is indexing all of those different versions. So when we run a search, run a collection, we're bringing back the keywords that I was looking for that recipient or that version of, or that place and time that it was sent. So we don't need that turned on, and then we can click on next. We can just review our settings here, and then we can hit submit. So our collection has been updated, and that will take a little moment in order to go away and collect that information for us. Now, while we're waiting for that collection, I just wanted to show you quickly the preservation hold library. So remember, as Sam and Alex are having this conversation and updating this single file, it's making changes to versions. We're actually taking a copy of those versions and then putting it into the preservation hold library. And here we can see that preservation hold library under the shared versions folder, and you'll see these GUIDs come up. So if someone's having a conversation with somebody else, like Sam is having a conversation with Dave, and they're talking about the same file and sharing that file, it doesn't actually take another copy of that conversation and that file, but it does have a marker in order to say, right, another version was shared and updates to that with somebody else, which is pretty neat. Also, as I said as well, we can make sure that we're tagging or applying a retention label to modern attachments that are also being shared. So we can make sure that we're keeping that version of the file for a period of time using things like records management. So the way that we do that is under our file plan, we can create a new retention label with the associated retention policies. So just conscious of time, I've already created one. So I've got this cloud attachment. It has a retention period when that label is applied to that content for 5 years. And for this, I've decided there's no action. But you could auto delete that content so it's purged out of the platform automatically if you wanted to do that. So once that label is set up, what we would do is go across to our label policies, and then we can auto apply that content based on if a modern attachment or cloud attachments, depending on what you want to call them, is being sent. So we could call this again cloud attach. And when we go next, you'll see this new option at the very bottom. So apply label to cloud attachments shared within Exchange or Teams. So that is if you're sending an email out that has a modern attachment, so a link to that content, we want to be able to apply a label to that content. If we're using Teams and we're chatting and I'm sharing content that way, then automatically apply a label to that content as well. So we can choose that option. If we just click on this little eye here, you'll see this banner at the very top that says cloud attachments are files stored in SharePoint, OneDrive, and 365 groups. They're attached via Outlook or Teams messages by a sharing link. So the label will only be applied to the version of the file that's being shared and does not apply to the email or the Teams message. Remember, we're just looking at content within SharePoint, not the message itself. So as a result, when I go through in the next stage, I won't be able to pick Exchange as a location because that's not where the content is stored, right? It's in SharePoint. Here, I'm just going to do a static retention policy. And notice there's no exchange option here, as it said. And then I'm looking for any content that resides either within SharePoint, OneDrive for Business, or 365 groups. So if I click next here, this is where I can pick up the label that I created, or a tag, if you like. And I can say the associated retention is going to be 5 years, and then just keep it, and then next, and then submit. So it'll take up to about 7 days for that policy to be enforced within the tenant. But now if anybody shares a modern attachment from either email or from Teams, guess what? It gets tagged and we retain that information for the period of time that I set. So as I mentioned, this is in public preview today. So as of now, which is August 2022, these are the supported locations in which modern attachments can be shared. So either via email, Teams chats, standard channel messages, private channel messages, but what's not supported is any modern attachments being shared via shared channel messages. Also, if somebody decides to copy and paste the URL, so the link individually or manually, that's also not supported for historical versions, and then bringing that back as part of that eDiscovery collection. So thank you very much for listening. That's all for now, and we'll speak to you next time.